Kia ora koutou, katoa. All good. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Ki mā kina kina ki uta, ki mā taratara ki tai. E he aki ana, te atakura, he tū, he huka, he hauhu, te he mauri ora. Well, thank you everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for Councillor Stewart for getting in here, finishing your committee by 2, which ensured we had a quorum. So thank you for that. As advised by email on the 1st of February, this meeting was rescheduled due to the state of emergency, and the business items considered today will be item 8, item 13, item 16, and also, as you'll see, there should be a piece of paper on your desk. There will also be an extraordinary item which we'll come to soon on the flood response and planning response to that. But first of all, as this is the first formal meeting since the Auckland floods on Auckland anniversary weekend, I'd like to officially put an acknowledgement on behalf of the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor, Councillors and Independent Māori Statutory Board to take the opportunity to acknowledge the loss of life, the effect on residents in our city, both personally and on property, and obviously want to acknowledge the amazing way our community has responded and assisted. I think what we saw was a catastrophic loss right across our city, something we've never seen before. Some of the records state it's, in some cases we saw 8.5 times the normal rainfall in January that we normally do, and within 6 hours I think it was about 6 times what we'd normally see in that period of time. I think we'll all have our own stories to tell over the time, and we've heard pretty horrendous stories on the doors of our local residents and businesses, and seen people from all walks of life effectively lose everything, which has, I know, been extremely overwhelming to many of us, and our community, of course, much more overwhelming. The second thing, obviously want to acknowledge those 4 members of our community who lost their lives, and what horrendous effect that will be having on their families as well. The other thing is the community response. I think probably the only good thing to come out of this disaster has been the best of our communities have come out, as they always do in occasions like this, but it's been phenomenal. All of you have been sharing what your communities have been doing, whether it's the surf lifesavers who got out in my community in the Wairoa Valley and saved about, I think, 69 people they saved. You know, I can't imagine what that would have been like in those moments. There's stories all of us will have. You know, I've had older residents talk to me about putting other older residents on their back and escaping floodwaters and pulling people out, and I'm sure many staff and anyone in this room has been affected by those stories. Our community, the New Zealand Defence Force, the Student Volunteer Army, just neighbours helping neighbours, food parcels just forming, and people just cooking meals for each other. I could go on, but I think just at this point, due to the effects, if we could all stand and maybe spend a minute just reflecting on what's the horrendous occasion. Thank you. Thank you all. Right, so we'll move to the business of today. There is quite a lot, and it'll be moving around. We've received absence on council, apologies from Councillor Bartley and Councillor Sayers on council business. We have early departure by Mayor Wayne Brown on council business, Councillor Julie Ferry at approximately 4 p.m. The Deputy Mayor will be leaving early as well, And we have an apology from Councillor Foley as well. Could I please have a mover? Councillor Henderson, someone to second. Councillor Ferry, all those in favour? Could I please have a mover to move for Councillor Fletcher to be joined by electronic attendance? Councillor Watson, second. Councillor Leone. All those in favour? Thank you, and welcome, Councillor Fletcher. Glad you can make it with us. Any declarations of interest? No. Confirmation of the minutes. Could I have a mover? Councillor Dalton. Cool. A seconder. Deputy Mayor Simpson. All those in favour? There are no petitions. For public input, we have a deferred request from the Auckland Yacht and Boating Association. The reasons they're wanting to come talk about the access to hard stands and those infrastructure of that nature across the city. The reason for deferring at this time, they were accepted last week, but we have deferred them due to the state of the emergency and the time-sensitive nature of this meeting. So they will be asked to come back to the Thursday, 2nd of March meeting. There is no local board input. Matter of extraordinary business. So I, myself and Councillor Dalton as Deputy Chair, in consultation with the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and staff, we're putting forward a extraordinary business item that the Planning, Environment and Parks Committee consider an extraordinary item commissioning of work into the implications of the Auckland Anniversary Weekend flooding event on Auckland's land use, planning, regulatory and other policy settings, and we'll be considering that at item 17. And we are noting that the reason the matter was not on the agenda is because this was compiled prior to the Auckland Anniversary flooding, and the reason why this matter cannot be delayed until a subsequent meeting is officers need to prepare advice prior to the next meeting of the Planning, Environment and Parks Committee. So do I move?
You can move that, yes.
Cool, I'll move that. And Deputy Chair, would you like to second? All those in favour? Any opposed? Thank you. And now we'll put a motion forward for precedence of business to bring forward that item, as the Mayor has to leave early, and I think it's appropriate for the Mayor to be here while discussing this issue, and he would like to be as well. So, the Mayor, would you like to move the consideration of moving this forward? And a seconder, Deputy Mayor Simpson. All those in favour? Any opposed? No. Thank you. Right, so we'll go to item 17, which a brief information is on your desk. Now, do I go straight to what? This? Now? Okay. I'll just speak briefly and then maybe go to the Mayor, or Megan first after me. No? Okay. Right. Sorry, this is a bit clearly on the fly a bit, everyone. Right, as the response, you've seen the effect to our community is large. I think the latest figures I've got here on red stickers. Our building teams have done a fantastic job of getting around to our communities. I've lost it. Maybe this one. 278 red stickered properties, 1,675 yellow stickered properties, and over 2,500 white stickered properties. And as you'll know in your communities, that doesn't tell the story of all the damage and destruction to homes. Many homes which have lost everything aren't included in those lists, as they may still be livable. The destruction around our community and council assets, we've got 85 sites that have been affected by storm damage. We've got libraries that are closed. 167 sites have been affected by damage to parks infrastructure, bridges, boardwalks and playgrounds. There's 18 playgrounds damaged, 90 boardwalks and bridges and other tracks, and 59 other significant pieces of damage. And that's what's been audited so far. There will unfortunately be more. There are lease sites that have been impacted, 21 of those, 14 are moderately or significantly impacted. And this, as you'll understand, there's a lot of slips on private land but to get the order of magnitude, there's 178 slips so far recorded on public land. 178, so you can imagine what the type of slips are on private land as well. Further assessment of works is required when it is safe. As the response to the Auckland Anniversary Weekend flooding event moves through the state of emergency to recovery and remediation, calls will increase to look where we have built homes, risks in vulnerable communities, and what work needs to be done next. Each of us as elected decision makers play a role in these phases. There are distinct pieces of work needed. The recovery phase is what we are in now. This phase is about fixing what has happened and an immediate response. And also, as the Mayor will be speaking to the media, or already has, there is also another emergency phase potentially this weekend with the cyclone on its way. People all over Auckland, individuals, communities are banding together to put right what has happened. The Mayor has led out on the review of the immediate response, and Councillor Stewart's committee will play a key part in implementing the outcomes of the review, and no doubt there will be others. What we need to do to mitigate and try and ensure that an event like this doesn't affect Auckland in the same way is a longer term critical piece of work to make sure that we are well prepared as we can be for similar events in the future, and that we don't find ourselves making short-term decisions that work against us. For some, this is the piece of work to make sure this never happens again. While the never again may not be a reality, we need to know how we can properly mitigate and understand how we plan and fund for the risks of events such as we have just seen. We need to better understand exactly what happened, where it happened, why it happened, to better understand what we need to do or what not to do. Therefore, after speaking with the Mayor and Deputy Chair Angela Dalton, I've asked our staff urgently to start this longer term work. I've asked that the work be scoped and agreed on with Councillor Dalton and I and a member of the IMSB. This will involve gathering evidence from Council's experts and in some cases buying in that independent advice. The reason that Councillor Dalton and I have asked the staff to lead this work urgently is the mandate for this work sits squarely with the Mayor, Deputy Chair and this committee in terms of setting direction. The work comes out of the recommendation or projects that may sit with other committees, for example, budget implications with the Mayor and governing body and stormwater implementation and transport effects and infrastructure. And I've discussed this with Councillor Watson before this committee and we'll discuss later with Councillor Fletcher as well. While we know that this event affected the whole region in some way, it affected places differently. To better understand where to from here, we need to understand the impacts on those places around the region. You will have heard the term dynamic adaptive pathways being used when we signed off Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, Auckland's climate plan. In this case, that may be what we need in some places and in other ways not. They are a part to play of the long-term climate change response. In other words, how do we better plan for and adapt over time to climate change risks in particular locations? They take time, evidence requires, and expertise, and effective communities will we need to engage with. Mana whenua is a key partner in this. In the future, the choices need to be made by those most affected, as those who benefit the most pay the most. Levels of private and public intergenerational benefit determine engagement and decisions. This will be a significant piece of work that we've asked our staff to go urgently scope up, and they are already doing this. It will take resource and guidance from us and will require reprioritisation of existing work programs as noted, and this is less about the immediate fix phase and more about the longer term policy settings that might need reconsideration, including part of the LTP. This will include all current plan changes underway, including Plan Change 78. Obviously, those are nearing hearings at the moment, but I've asked for staff advice about options should we wish to change or rescope or further reinforce our submissions already. These kinds of events are severe and devastating, but unfortunately will not be unexpected for our region in the future. Over time, Council has been on a journey making regulatory changes and investments, and so is the government. Our Council group is thankfully not starting from zero, but this work is about putting the flood event in context. We have a lot of strategic direction in place. Te Tarakia Tāwhiri, Auckland's climate plan, our water strategy, our response to the government's national adaptation plan, and our too much water strategies and other strategies that we've already had underway. Many of us have spoken to ministers We are also asking for an urgent meeting with ministers on this, around legislative change, around financial impacts, around how they can help with the medium to long-term recovery. I personally was out with Climate Minister James Shaw yesterday, showing him some of the devastation, but also some of what council has been doing in areas where, you know, we may have had the opportunity to clear areas or redesign areas and bring in blue-green infrastructure such as Te Ara Awataha on an area that used to flood that was less affected this time. So right, that is probably me at this point. If there are questions, I might go to the Mayor if you would like to speak to this first, and then maybe questions go to Megan at this point. Obviously, this is all at the beginning phase, but all of you have come. I've heard from all of you around what is needed to be done, and the fact we need the evidence to ensure we do it properly. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. I totally support the direction of this emergency recommendation, noting that we should add an IMSB to the recommendation as well. Okay, good. I worked with the field teams of inspectors in both the northern suburbs and the southern suburbs, and I have had experience of having led such teams in the Christchurch earthquake. I was very impressed with the work and the preparation of those teams, and I supported what they were doing. They adopted about the right level, not being too harsh and considering things. But there are a lot of lessons to be learnt from this. This will take a long time, and to get underway with this, it's a very large amount of work for Megan's team, but it's absolutely essential. We face not only an unknown cost, but we can also be absolutely sure that a lot of people will be lawyering up to try and transfer the blames of various things onto us, which were not ours. So we have to think about this. There are a number of places we've seen inappropriate forms of construction and inappropriate intensification efforts in valleys. Some of these ones are works that have been commissioned subsequent to have been turned down by our council, but applicants going to the Environment Court, so we need to pick up on all of these things. It's a huge amount of work along the cliffs and valleys of our district. So I support your staff on this. I understand just how big this is, and I'm sure everybody in the room understands how important this is. In the short term, it'll reflect on just how well the response to Plan Change 88, which did actually, the council did put in some pretty good restrictions there, and it'll be interesting to know how well they fit with what we've learnt. So I'm delighted to support this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for your leadership and support for this. Is there any other questions for either staff or myself or the Mayor? Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair and Deputy Chair, for leading this. It's very important. Megan, can I just ask a question? This is on the looking at the planning framework. Where are we right now in the consenting process for applications that might be in the process of being assessed, decisions being made, where we are fast learning that that application is for an activity in a hazard zone that we definitely know of right now? I'm thinking of an application for a swimming pool on a cliff, dwellings in extreme flood-prone zones, etc. So how is the regulatory team responding to what they know right now and what they will be getting to know in days and weeks? And I have a second question, Chair.
Through the Chair, thanks, Councillor Darby. That's a really good question, and of course the immediate response at the moment is really the recovery and just dealing with the now. We have started to work with regulatory, and part of this work will be to do exactly that. Of course, within the resource management framework and consenting framework, there were always legislative parameters and kind of constraints about what we can and can't do, but we need to understand that better, and to your point, to get an understanding of any consents or plan changes actually that maybe have a different risk profile than perhaps we thought about 2 weeks ago. So look, I can't give you a number, and I can't tell you, you know, kind of what we've done or what we're doing, but we're beginning that work. And it may be that we can come back on the 2nd of March to give you a sense of that, I'm not sure. But we will also need to just see what any legal constraints or parameters we have around our ability to change or alter some of the work we're doing on those matters.
Just a second part to that, Chair, if you don't mind. Megan, I would appreciate us probably taking a position that is risk averse on behalf of the wider community rather than maybe the applicant at this stage. Now, I know we've got the law to be, you know, the resource management law to abide by, but there's a new, Chair, there's a new section in the monthly housing report, it's section 8, and it shows that, it just came in yesterday for those that do receive this, and it shows that in the November month, 18%, in the December month, 16% of dwellings consented are consented in hazard zones, flood zones, cliffs, erosion zones, the rest of it. And that is a new section. I've just checked this morning. It's a new section that's just been added to that monthly. And it's our wake up. You know, we knew this, but maybe didn't know it. We've got to act on this information and keep building the information.
Through the chair, I'll take that as a, I'm not sure if there's a response. I understand and agree, and that's exactly why we're looking at those settings, those policy settings, because maybe the settings in the unitary plan or in our design standards are not, aren't good enough anymore or may need to change. So that's that longer term work that we're talking about.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Just from my understanding, and where it fits, it may not even be in this committee, but maintenance policies. Council runs a what they call an outcomes-based policy with maintenance, which really just means it's not maintenance scheduled anyway. It's a breakdown service. Where, you know, the public are calling for maintenance and the public are observing where programmed maintenance hasn't taken place, and they believe has, and I believe in cases has added to the problem. How does that fit into this planning process?
Through the chair, perhaps a couple of areas. One is it can often, it fundamentally could be a budgeting or investment decision, particularly through the long-term plan, about how much money we're putting towards maintenance, renewals, all of that kind of area. It doesn't necessarily need a policy, but I would expect that this council would want to talk about both the investment but the resourcing that we put in, or the importance we put on maintenance and renewals, and even to our own land, whether we are going to fix everything that has been affected by the flood, or whether there will be areas that we decide not to do it. And that's ultimately a budget and an action kind of decision. So there's two areas that can be part of this work, but I think it will also come through budget conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Newman.
Megan, and through you, Chair, I will speak to this, but Megan, can I ask, and it follows on from what Chris Darby's just raised, which I think is very pertinent, and I support him, but whilst you might not have had discussions with ministers, I'm just wondering if you have had some at least preliminary discussion with MFE and with MB around this planning framework, and whether they are preparing a brief of information advice to ministers, potentially to inform subsequent changes. I mean, arguably, the risk profiling in the Auckland Unitary Plan was never good enough, but a lot of that has been directed and enabled because Parliament has required it. So Parliament acts on the advice of its officials. So have you got a line of sight to any of that initial discussion? And then I do reserve my right to speak.
Thanks, Councillor Newman. No, I don't know if there's specific advice going up to relevant ministers at this point. I'm not aware of that.
Councillor Lee.
Just further to that, further to Councillor Darby's reference to resource consent applications, building consents and so on in hazard zones and other areas, do the emergency regulations, the state of emergency, facilitate the council pausing or intervening in those processes? I imagine it does, but normally it would not be able to. So is the emergency regulations helpful in that respect?
Through the chair, that's a great question, Councillor Lee. I'm not thoroughly aware of it to be able to give you a comprehensive answer. There are emergency provisions, as I know you know, in the Resource Management Act itself, but the civil defence kind of state of emergency sits obviously in that piece of legislation and that jurisdiction. I'm not aware, just off the top of my head, that there are civil defence kind of emergency provisions that then enable you to trump effectively consenting in RMA processes. I'm happy to come back to you if that's something of use to you.
It's just something for you to consider, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Councillor Lee actually more or less said what I was going to say, and I was just going to, back in 2000 when we were Manukau City Council, we actually had a moratorium in a big part of the Howard, Pekaringa and Botany ward that we knew had flooding issues. We had that moratorium, and I know some of the councillors that are still sitting around this table will remember, like a broken record, I said one day it's going to come home to bite, and we're allowing building to be built on, development to go on to floodplains, and it's going to happen, and it's happened. And I think what Councillor Lee just suggested, and Councillor Darby, I think we really do need to look at saying stop, and we need a moratorium in these areas. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And I have asked ministers if we can have, or if it's possible to have emergency powers to do those sorts of things. So we do need that advice fairly quickly. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks. 3 questions, Chair, but I'll be quick. This to me looks like quite a wide scope of work. So do we have the capacity to do this, and do we have an indication of budget?
Sorry, Councillor Henderson, it was where's the budget? Is it where the budget's coming from?
Do we have the capacity to do this in such a short turnaround, because the scope seems fairly large?
Yeah.
And also, how much money are we talking?
Yeah, so you'll sneakily realise that we're talking about a scope of work just in the next few weeks, as opposed to doing and finishing all of it. So that work will continue. Paragraph 5, Councillor Hills has recognised that, of course, this is unbudgeted, as so much of the immediate relief is unbudgeted as well. I can certainly say that this will require some reprioritisation. It may affect the forward work programme of this committee and possibly others, because, of course, we'll be working across the group to help with this. So there will be consequences. I don't know what they are specifically, but as with so much at the moment, it's unbudgeted, but we can either move money or additional money or different money. We'll just have to get to that point when we get to it.
Thanks. We've just come off a huge process of Plan Change 78 and doing our submissions and looking into all this kind of stuff. I know we did a lot of work on special character areas. Did staff work on floodplain areas as part of that work? Like, to what extent are we talking about duplication?
So through the chair, as part of Plan Change 78, we used that qualifying matter opportunity in the Act to to limit or decrease otherwise, you know, the 3x3 intensification in areas of floodplains. So that we notified that in August last year. So part of the work that I think the Chair and Deputy Chair are asking for here is to have a look about maybe where flooding occurred in relation to those floodplains and whether there's any change or difference that we might want to put in our position moving forward on Plan Change 78, increasing areas. I don't know. That's part of the work that we'll do. So we did highlight and do work on the flooding elements. Yeah.
Thank you. And last question. Look, I've seen some figures, including in the media, but does Council have an opinion on areas that have been intensified recently versus ones that haven't? Which ones have received more or less damage in the floods generally?
I'll have a go at that. Having been out in a lot of the areas with the teams, and that's the kind of stuff I look for. The heritage areas tended not to be so bad because in the old days they were kind of a bit more aware of the dangers of cliffs and valleys, but we've got a bit more brave or foolish, I'm not quite sure which word since. Surprisingly, some of the more recent things in South Auckland, even done by Kāinga Ora, are quite questionable, because some of the reasons that land was left unavailable was that it possibly wasn't a wise place to build. And so, the heritage areas did better, really, but there are exceptions to every rule. Thanks for that. And I did actually want to add a couple of bits in there while I've got the microphone. The added cost of this work will be part of that large lump which we'll sit down and negotiate with government and other agencies at some stage. And so there are some things, just like what we've done with all the bins on the booms. You just have to do that, and we'll sort out the finances later on. One item that I failed to mention, which will have a driving impact on all of this, which I have raised with the Prime Minister, is insurance. A number of those people will not only have the question of the cost of reinstatement, but most likely there will be a large number of cliff houses and valley houses which fail to get reinsurance. That's an issue which is probably bigger than the council, and I've raised that with the Prime Minister to have some thoughts about the solution to that, because there's no great point in rebuilding if they won't reinsure, or is there another alternative? So it's a nasty big piece of work there, Megan. You have to do it, and this is really just the recommendation to kick it off rather than do it. We'll go through many iterative learnings as we get further into it and as other people enter the fray. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Councillor. And although it's anecdotal, which everything is right now, is I would say in myself and Councillor Darby's community, the newly intensified areas actually fared better than they used to, but that was due to us putting in, and the government putting in better infrastructure as well, dropping the fields as a dry pond and things like that. The other issue is around the qualifying matters in our area, only from a cursory look, is the slips have come down in the areas we asked for low density with a qualifying matter for coastal hazards, and the areas which flooded in our community were the areas covered by our lower density zoning with the floodplain qualifying matter. So it does show that our teams were very, have been pushing that as our evidence for those qualifying matters, and there are other submitters pushing back on that, but I assume that may further help our evidence. The Councillor Walker.
Sure. I've just got a question as it goes to scope. If we base this around the flood event we've just had, my concern around scope is it could have been much worse. If we had significant storm surges and high tides in a whole range of areas that I've certainly pointed out on many occasions, the stormwater would not have escaped. And the flooding to those areas, low-lying areas in my community, Manly, Rewa, Red Beach, Sharkles Bay, would have been catastrophic, and certainly through many low-lying areas of the bays. I mean, catastrophic, far worse than what actually occurred. So my concern is that the scope needs to take those things into account. It could have been worse. The other concern that I've got is, I mean, by infrastructure, I'm assuming implicit in that is stormwater, but the necessity to plan around far more than 1 and 100-year events, which is essentially what our pipe work is based on, and the lack of consideration, and again it goes to scope here, around overland flow paths, many of which are on private property, and the approach that has been taken internally is not to worry about that without putting too fine a word on it because of budgetary considerations and policy over time. So I'm hoping that those things will be taken into consideration. And the other matter that's not there under scope is finances, the impact on council finances, and particularly the role of development contributions and the inadequacy of development contributions in funding, the relationship between that on rates and overall funding, which is essentially part of the systemic problem that goes to finances that has put us where we are. So I would hope within scope that the bigger picture is part of what is under consideration. Otherwise, my concern is, again, we have a superficial approach as we've had before, and we don't learn. And I would hope also in terms of scope that we look at other cities like Brisbane, other cities, sister cities in some instances like Brisbane, who have given us advice in the past which we haven't followed, so we've known about this. Thank you.
Through the chair, just a quick response. Thanks, Councillor Walker. Certainly, if I try to, kind of summarise a high level around the scope, ultimately this big conversation, which we'll do over time, is what is the council's risk profile now around some of this? Has it changed? Are we not willing to accept the kind of settings, whether it's 1 in 100 flow path, whatever it might be? Is that not enough anymore? Does it need to increase? And therefore, what are the implications for our communities on those decisions? What would happen if it was a different kind of policy setting? So it does include the matters you've raised. I think the funding, your finance funding one, is a really good point. So thank you for that. And certainly any other ideas councillors have around the scope, I'd be very grateful to hear. But I understand your points. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And may I also add my thanks to everybody for being able to participate today, and the offer to try and draw on any further information. But I have a very specific question, and that is, again, looking at the scope of what you are looking to undertake, and I applaud that. In the early 2000s, actually, Legacy Auckland City undertook a multi-million-dollar integrated catchment study, which took over 4 years and gave a very detailed picture of Auckland's flooding-prone areas that were vulnerable and assessed the existing infrastructure. When I've done an overlay of the recent flooding events with the work that Craig Hobbs' team are giving us on a daily basis on the assessments, there is a remarkable similarity with the body of that work. That work didn't seem to be taken into account when we consider the qualifying matters with Plan Change 78. Can I have the assurance that those who are working on this will draw on any of those legacy plans that gave us at that time quite a clear picture? This was work that was independently assessed. Will you be able to work on that work, or will you be starting from scratch?
Through the chair, Kia ora, Councillor Fletcher, thank you for that. No, we won't be starting from scratch. We need to use the information we already have at hand, so I can absolutely assure you that we will particularly look at that document and that piece of work that you have raised. But more broadly, yes, we should start with what we have and to determine whether that is still up to date, and there may need to be some changes and some more work, and we will work through that with you over time. Thanks, Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Megan, and I'm willing to provide any information that I have because I think we all need to work together on this.
Thank you so much, Councillor. Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. This is a good carry on from my ward colleague. I'm interested to know, I think, yeah, it's vital we do this and good to see we're moving swiftly. I'd like to understand how this might interact with some of the previous work we've done around managed retreat, coastal inundation, in particular in the face of climate change. So just obviously, you know, this is the scope of works. You don't know what you're going to do until you work out what you're going to do. But if we just have a little bit of an idea of what the plan is in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ferry. Yes, we a couple of years ago started the body of work around the shoreline adaptation plans. Largely that had been focused because in our legal sense, we could only really focus on public assets and public land, although we took into consideration private land. We've only done 3 of those so far and we're working through them, but we also have given that feedback through the government's national adaptation plan around what the heck do we do under these circumstances for private land, working with government, working with insurers. Obviously, that I hope that is front of mind, that needs to be sped up from government side of things. Megan might have more to say on that. But we were clear around the complications which we're now facing before this.
Look, through the chair, I think, you know, there's some really big conversations that this council may wish to have or may not wish to have, and managed retreat is one of them. That is, it's easy to say, but, you know, it's a very complicated and a very personal kind of matter, isn't it, for people involved. So I'm certainly willing to enable you to have that conversation. It will ultimately be up to you about how far you go with that. But of course, management retreat is also something that the central government, in my view, should be involved in as well. So maybe the scope of that is going to perhaps be a bit longer, but also depend how we might want to do that and how you might want to have that conversation with communities.
Councillor Watson.
Didn't have my hand up, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Might have. Member Ashby.
Kia ora. Thank you. First just wanted to acknowledge the importance of this. I think you know, a lot of our iwi Māori communities have been talking about this for a long time. So just, I guess, turning that into a question, just 2 points in terms of scope, is I guess the mātauranga or Māori dimension to this is probably a rich source of knowledge to bring in and build into it in terms of these places and their resilience or otherwise. You know, iwi hapu been in this place the longest, and so have very, very long memories of this. So just a scoping question. The second one, I know this is just the start of it, but we've heard about Kāinga Ora, and I'm just mindful of the Supporting Growth Alliance mahi that's looking at places in what I would certainly consider flood-prone areas. So it's just, I guess, how wide you cast the net, while still not casting it so wide, you can't actually progress anything. So, thanks.
Kia ora, Member Ashby. Really good questions. On your first, the scope's kind of the what. The how, I think, is part of the 2nd of March, but also onwards, and certainly in my view, iwi Māori and mātauranga Māori will be really important as part of that. So my expectation is that over time there will be engagement with all communities, including iwi Māori as well. So that's definitely part of the thinking, but it's possibly more of a how one does it, as well as the what. Your supporting growth comment, look, yes, you're right. The world continues to carry on, doesn't it, even in shocks like this. And so it's a little bit connected to Councillor Darby's question in that kind of consenting world. We also need to think of these other processes, whether it's plan changes or notifications like this with designations, and whether they should continue like they are. Do you put a pause on them? Do we just keep going and we learn over time? So don't have an answer to that one, but I think it's a really good call out. Thank you.
Kia ora, Member Ashby, and I think also with Te Taraki e Tāwhiri Auckland's climate plan, that was, I think, one of our first where all iwi, mana whenua and mā tāwaka were involved from the beginning and worked with us in that partnership, and a lot of that discussion was around adaptation, and we need to ensure that is, you know, that work is happening, but it needs to speed up, and we need to use those examples and that experience and those stories to understand the lay of the land, and we have been doing that on a project by project basis, as you would have seen in Te Ara Awataha and other situations, but it needs to clearly be at the forefront of every decision. Thank you. No more members are asking for a question, so I'll go to speakers, and I think in order... Oh, right. I will be moving this, and Councillor Dalton was seconding, sorry. Good to remember that. Speakers, I think we had Councillor Darby, were you first earlier?
Oh, look, just probably briefly, I've been reflecting quite a bit on sort of the language that's used to describe this event, and I've heard words like unprecedented, 1 in 200, nothing we could have done could have prevented this. And I've been sort of saying to myself, all those descriptions are not appropriate. You know, we may not have seen this before in Auckland, but we've seen it, and it was just a matter of time. We've seen very localised, very dense rainfalls only just a few weeks ago in where I live, but it was just localised, and it brought an incredible rainfall. But the balance of Auckland read about some thunderstorms in a particular area. This was a deluge right across, like the dense dots were landing everywhere. And the 1 in 200, when you mention that, I find myself, it's almost like you're creating an excuse for not having woken up to this risk. And of course, then there's this, you do hear, nothing we could have done could have prepared for this. And we know that's incorrect as well. All of us know that that's incorrect. Niwa told us about this likelihood more than a decade ago. Now, all the research is there, you know, it's all there. And I know we've been moving in the direction of water-sensitive design, but, you know, we've been paddling with one paddle on the side of the boat in that direction. And no doubt this is, you know, more than extreme. I also just want to sort of say, I don't want to get caught up in this high density versus low density argument about, you know, where the flooding happened. Let's wait for the real evidence to come in rather than, as you, Chair, say, rightly relying on anecdotal evidence. But if I can say, some of the anecdotal evidence I've seen, I live in Devonport, I live on Stanley Point. Now, I don't want to make this just about my place, but Stanley Point is a lot smaller now. And it is a heritage zone, and there are properties galore that now have, you know, 5 metres of their front boundary in the ocean, along with the, you know, coastal Putuawa canopy. And there are 9 red-stickered properties, and it's not a big area. There are 9 red-stickered properties there. My guess is that it's in, you know, the impacted areas are in high-density zones and low-density zones as well. But let's wait for the evidence on that. But that rolling average of numbers that we're consenting in hazard zones is 2,358. So in the last 12 months, we have consented that many dwelling units in hazard zones. And those hazard zones are floodplains, flood-prone areas, inundation zones, and erosion zones. I never realised that we were consenting so many buildings to be built in such places, and then thousands of people to be put in those places, or to live but maybe not fully understand the place that they're living in. And the last thing I reflect on is reflecting on maybe the names around Auckland. And Chair, in our area, we have a place called Wairau, and it was an absolute flood zone. I only woke up recently to what that name means, the place of gathering waters, and did it not gather? Deep and dangerous and extremely costly. People have lost livelihoods, and I'm just waking up to that name, Wairau.
Kia ora, Councillor. Councillor Newman, you're still wanting to?
Yeah, look, thank you, Chair, and I very much enjoyed listening to what Councillor Darby just said, because I found myself in almost full agreement with him, which is great. I think that the scope of this, I think that the Mayor should be part of the design of the scope of this too. If, with your indulgence, Chair, I think you should add his name in. The challenge here, there's a couple of things. The scale of the work is far beyond the capacity of the organisation to quickly turn this around. I think that's understood. Secondly, it's not necessarily possible for a proper legislative response and addressing the funding implications with ministers for a period of time. And the reason for that is that if you were to do that, I mean, I think firstly, going back to the integrated catchment study work that Councillor Fletcher referred to is very good. The second thing that would most obviously have to happen is that the cases that came up in the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan hearings will all have to be reread. Every single one of them, particularly on the catchments and the infrastructure, because all of the evidence statements and all of the submissions and the deliberation at that time for the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan of 2016, dating back, so you're going back quite some time, all that will have to be read, because actually the modelling work, I am sure, that was prepared at the time will by and large stand up. But of course, what has happened is that, well, what did we do? We had the housing called Special Housing Areas Act. We had all those SHAs that have been consented. We've had a very permissive Auckland Unitary Plan. We now have the, we can't stop plan changes or applications that come through privately. We've seen how hard it is to stop that. And now we, of course, are directed by what Parliament has required. Both major parties in the Parliament have required the enabling stuff for the NPSUD, for which Plan Change 78 has been prescribed and notified. And it, you know, I don't think that it's, I mean, my view is that Plan Change 78 now needs to be pulled entirely. There's no need to rush this. You can't rush it because you couldn't move forward on an evidentiary basis, largely because of the work that's required within the scope of this. Commissioning hasn't been done yet. So, you know, Parliament needs to respond to this as much as Council, but Parliament just doesn't have the information, certainly based on what Megan Tyler just said. The officials haven't even been talking about it, from what I understand. So I think that there's a lot more work here that's going to need to be nutted out, and I'm not sure that you'll be able to address the scope of this fully in the time required. And if you are, I just, in terms of the implementation of a piece of work to review, that is going to have to be subject to a lot of resource in-house and external, and actually there are people who could potentially do some of this work, but are possibly, you know, there are consultants external to this council as well who are probably quite implicated based on some of the past evidence of their advocacy and various plan changes and hearings that have come up previously, Chair. So I don't know quite how you're going to do this, and I don't know who is supposed to do this. I agree with this work, but I think that the scope of it and the ability to stand it up is probably too ambitious. I support this. I do think the Mayor needs to be involved, and I also think the other thing is, frankly, this will have significant budget implications, and how we stand up the budget for the immediate response is not fully known yet, given that we're just about to go up for consultation on a budget which appears entirely theoretical to me at the moment. And secondly, that Aucklanders will need to be aware that whatever we decide on that budget almost certainly will have to change, as we simply have to move around scarce resources to aid recovery as to other things that we might have otherwise liked to do, but most certainly will not be able to do. And the final thing, Chair, is that there is a liability argument that will inevitably come up. So I would be quite keen to get a legal briefing in relation to some of this, because the Mayor has pointed out that people will be lawyering up, and last man standing unfortunately is council, and people will want to take a piece out of us, I'm sure. So I would be quite keen to understand the legal implications of what developments have been enabled in areas where the evidence to enable it was quite contested, but it was consented anyway. And I wonder if that could be picked up within the subsequent scope of what you're about to do. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor Newman. And the legal side of things will be covered on our side, but also I've added in the C legislative, because a lot of what may need to change is Building Act requirements, etc., that we cannot often push back on. So that is a discussion that's needed to be had. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, just a number of very quick points, and I'm thinking my first one is an important one, and that's to acknowledge some of the people around this table who for quite some time now have been drawing our attention, and I'm not one of them, I'm not proud to say, about this very sort of response and the ill-advised nature of some of our planning decisions in the past. Leave the plan change 78 aside, but just this concern with flood-prone areas, areas of vulnerability, and I think of Councillor Stewart out in Howick and Councillor Walker going back to Rodney District Council days. It's no comfort to say, 5, 10, 20 years on that they were right, but it perhaps is an indication that we do sometimes have to start listening to some of our own people, both within the council chamber and out in the community, who do know what they're talking about. Because in my view, we're often very quickly ready to move on or to pretend that this has just come out of the blue, where actually it hasn't. So I welcome this work. I don't think it necessarily has to be bigger than Ben-Hur, as Councillor Fletcher alluded to. A lot of this work and finding has actually been done in one form or another and is available. So we're like a lot of things within the council, encyclopedic library is actually there that can be drawn on already. Similarly with Councillor Darby's good examples there, thinking of the place of gathering waters. I think of the Wairau Valley back to, when I was at Westlake. It was a dangerous place. You felt dangerous when you were down there when it started raining, and it didn't take too much rain to just turn that place into a raging torrent. And there were people who have died in similar circumstances to the unfortunate people who'd passed away this time back in the 1970s. So the community know, but we do have a lot of newer people in our community. I would just say in conclusion, in respect of this work, there were a number of areas also that expected to get hit or have a similar track record as places like Milford and Wairau Valley that didn't go quite as bad this time as you would have expected. Some were just teetering on the brink. So in Whangapraoa Peninsula, we had some places that were just on the brink of really flooding badly, but just pulled back. And in some places, in part to the good work that council had done over many years, that actually saved them from a kind of disastrous situation. So I would hope that in this work that we are aware that as much as there's some clearly identifiable areas around that have been hit this time, there's many, many more who dodged a bullet to a certain extent. And I think as far as the rainfall goes, that not all places were hit evenly, although it was heavy right across the city. Obviously others were hit a lot harder. Next time round, it might be someone else who's the Wairau Valley or some such a similar disastrous outcome. So I hope, Mr Chair, in following up, that this work can be done expeditiously, because we're now in an environment where we don't have time for big, lengthy reflections and policy rollouts over years and years. We're expecting another event, this week. So there's a real urgency to this, and I support your initiative here. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Turner.
While I'm in agreement with everybody here, I'd like to just put a tradie perspective on it, and a close association with my son, who's a certifying builder and certifying drain layer. The comment that lots of places how many places are being allowed to be built in floodplains, etc., is based on what the council has zoned their properties with and put floodplain drawings over them and stuff like that. And that has been getting more stringent over the years. So there's plenty of times I personally have been to sites and you look at the plans and the site and say, this has been called a floodplain? And the mitigation costs that have been forced upon the building consent is huge as well, and in some cases I consider over necessary. So all I'm saying is that it's just, I just want a knee-jerk reaction without actually looking at the facts and the figures. And also, what are we doing with all these people who own property if we then say, well, now you can't build on it? So I just want to bring that as just a bit of balance. Thank you.
Very important point. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks. I'm really thankful to be on the same side as a lot of my colleagues in this debate, which has not been usual in terms of housing. Just acknowledging you for this work. I do support it. I'm a bit concerned about the scope and the costs, but we'll get there when we get there. Look, to be honest, if you'll indulge me, I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge, firstly, those that lost their lives in the flood and their families, those that have had their lives turned upside down. For residents in my ward, that happened twice in 18 months. That's very tough. Look, I want to publicly thank the council staff that have worked so hard. We're asking accountants and planners to fill sandbags and coordinate emergency responses that they haven't necessarily been trained for, and they did a fantastic job. Your city really appreciates your work. Thanks for that. Also they're community heroes as well. I met a guy yesterday that towed a guy with a kayak out of his house, tetraplegic guy, a neighbour, that would have otherwise, lost his life. So that's heroism, and we'll all have stories like that. It's beautiful. Anyway, we need to do something about places like Waimoko Stream in my ward that broke its banks again. That is a hazard to life, right? We wouldn't leave exposed wiring in our house. So we can't leave these places that are clearly hazards, that are clearly a risk to life, completely untouched. We have to do something. The Mayor was right in the press conference where he said, look, we've been building in places that we shouldn't have been building. I agree with him completely. But we need to be clear that unless the houses were consented and built in the last 5 months, then they come under the old rules. They don't come under the Plan Change 78 in the first place. And actually, Plan Change 78 has qualifying matters for flood-prone areas. So in some respects, PC 78 is actually it's not the problem, it's the solution. We've just got to make it work for us a bit better. Part of the solution for me is a regulatory issue, so I'm really glad that we've got that in the resolution as well. Acknowledging Councillor Ferry for writing some great stuff about this. Water-sensitive development, a city that drinks water through the ground, right? A city where we protect our trees a bit better that soak up so much of the floodwaters. This is the kind of stuff that we can do, and we can have great intensification. That's not going to cause a risk to life to people. Actually, in my ward, the intensified subdivisions, they held up fine, by and large. It was the older houses that really got slammed. And of course, I've said this 100 times, so feel free to turn your ears off for the next minute or so. councillors, but look, we have locked out people from the best land in the city to build houses in the central city, places that were reasonably untouched by the flood. And I'm representing parts in my ward, Henderson, Ranui, places like that, that were completely slammed. Some of the poorest communities in Auckland that don't have the ability to bounce back. So we've got to think about that when we're looking at this stuff. You know, some of the stuff we've got to do is looking at funding clearing the culverts better, funding healthy waters, even support for people that can't build their house back safely. I think we need to talk to the government about red zoning, places like Waimoko Stream. You just shouldn't have houses there. We can't expect people to build them back. They're too afraid for their lives. So this plan, I actually have a lot of optimism for the scope of work. This is the kind of stuff I'm hoping we'll get back so that we can plan our city better in the future. Thanks, Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Walker.
A couple of things I want to speak to. The first one was introduced by Councillor Newman, and that goes to the consideration of actually who does this investigation. And the context and around that's really important, because one of the problems we have in Auckland is because we are the employer, it's very difficult for people that engage with this council, and if you haven't gone along with people, you can have problems. The related issue that also needs to be addressed is around governance and oversight, and that's around the part of this council. In the 2010 to 2013 term of this council, there was a subcommittee that I chaired, and Stormwater reported to it, and I took an outstanding interest in it, as did a number of the people around that committee. But frankly, since then, Stormwater, in terms of its prominence, its oversight, its governance, has actually progressively gone downhill. And the other thing that's necessary to know is, back in the day, we had some excellent people in Stormwater, and within a relatively short period of time, the first tier, the second tier, and the third tier were eliminated. And there was some publicity in the Herald at the time around some of the background to that. There was a two-page spread. And certainly it was at that time that I saw some of the systemic changes starting to occur that have put us where we are today. So by all means, we can look at some scope here and we can investigate some things, but we also have to look at the governance and the oversight role, the amount of time we actually give to oversight around stormwater, the reports that are being brought to us, and in particular, the people that are going to be advising us around this, because it will hit some rather sensitive areas. And those of you that were around in the period of time when the Water Sensitive Cities Unit did a report on council, and I'd visited their unit at their location in Monash University. There were some excellent people there. They did a report, and then internally, the officers commissioned a peer review to try and debunk that, even though the points that were being made were, in my view, very, very accurate. And some of the reporters here that were around then may even remember that. So again, I just go to scope. I refer to the points I made earlier, but also the necessity around our role and who is going to be looking at it, because I think that it will be somewhat revealing and will necessitate some significant changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. No more speakers? Thank you. Thank you all for this debate. Thank you for supporting. Sorry, Councillor.
I'm so sorry.
Apologies.
I just wish, in conclusion, and I think a lot has been said, but this is a critical time for Auckland where we are literally at a watershed. And I just hope that politics don't dominate what happens going forward. I hope that it's evidence-based And I think that the proposal before us gives us an opportunity to actually try and remove the politics and move it away from blame. And in the pathway that does come forward, there may be some backtracking, there may be some changes. And I think we've got to be gracious in that, because right now, and certainly in my ward and Councillor Ferry's ward, there's a lot of people and a lot of anguish and a lot of fear. And I think if we can keep our citizens and the future to the forefront, it will help us in this difficult task ahead. I would also like to personally thank all of the operational staff who've been leading this. I've laughed a couple of times. We've got our own Dr. Ashley in terms of Rachel Kelleher and the way that she has fronted this and led us on a daily basis and given confidence to people. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Mayor. He may not be the best communicator, but at the moment, he is the best person with his background, his experience, and I think his willingness to lead us forward at this time. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been pleading that we have action of this kind. So I feel very, very happy in supporting it and hope that the relevant ministers of the Crown can come as quickly as possible to the table to try and give the confidence to Aucklanders, despite the fact that it's local or central government, that we're working in an integrated way to find a common sense response moving forward. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you all again for your points and the effort you've been going to in your communities and your willingness to support this. I guess from a helicopter view, this is obviously a climatic event. This is climate change. Last year was officially our hottest year again. 8 of the last 10 years were 8 of the hottest years in our history. We had the wettest winter, followed by the wettest November on record. I think we then had the wettest December on record, and now undoubtedly this has been our wettest, I think, month ever in January. This is what we've been saying and what people have been saying for over 30 years would happen. It's just unfortunately coming much faster than we hoped for, I guess. 2020, before COVID, we had the skies turn red with those horrible fires in Australia, something that we could never imagine would happen. Then we had 2 years of record drought and dealing with that, and now we're dealing with the opposite of that with record rains and floods. I think we all have the horrendous stories, the looks on people's faces. Our communities are anxious and stressed. Trying to access help when you've lost everything is pretty overwhelming for everyone dealing with that right now. I've heard stories of heroism, but also stories of absolute pain, and people are still unsure of how to describe what happened and describe what to do next. I think there is a case, and I have been speaking to ministers, and I'm sure many of you will too, around we need help to know what to do. This is of scale of Christchurch type disaster. We are going to need government help undoubtedly to help fund this. Do we need emergency laws? What do we need to rapidly change some of the things that we've been saying through our water strategies, through Te Tarakia Tawhiri? It's all there in the plans and the strategies we've implemented over the last couple of years, and in many of the actions and the budgets we approved in the last 2 long-term plans, especially around climate, around water, around the direction we're heading, which has been fantastic. And you will see that in some of those areas where we've put that infrastructure in, they fared slightly better than some of the other areas. But we're going to need help to do that quickly, and we don't have those tools in some circumstances. So we're going to need mana whenua, the Mataronga Māori views from long ago saying that you can't change the water's path. It will choose itself, and we've seen that. Daylighting streams, showing what our communities can do, working together is clearly what we're going to continue to do. But with this the scope of work, we will try and make it as big and specific as possible because it needs to cover as much as we can. And talking to the Climate Minister yesterday, often in a crisis, often in these situations, we do leave things too long and people forget quickly, or those who weren't affected don't realise how bad it was and don't understand why we need to move. And so I think all of us clearly believe that we need to move quickly. We need to give people answers and make sure we aren't making any plans in the future that put people at risk. So I just want to once again thank Aucklanders, especially those that have been affected and those that are helping, and thank everyone, whether it's council staff, emergency services, just neighbours and friends, marae, churches, everyone who's been involved and will continue to be involved. But it's really important that we don't forget, and that next week we don't forget, and that everyone is focused on this through the recovery, but also the response and dealing with what comes next. So kia ora everyone, thank you so much for supporting this. All those in favour? Aye. Anyone opposed? No. Thank you. We're going to have a 5-minute break.